Welcome, welcome. So, I am Dr. Patrice Berry, and I am so pleased to be co hosting this stream where we are going to be talking about custody and mental health, how those two things can kind of come together legally from a legal perspective, which UK lawyer is going to be giving us that, and then I'll be giving the psychological perspective. Karen, if you can introduce yourself.
Hi, I'm Karen Cole from Legal Minded Friends, and I'm a lawyer in the UK who helps litigants in person. So that is somebody who can't afford a solicitor or they don't qualify for legal aid. So they would hire someone like me to assist them with the legal process, helping them to make decisions.
That is really awesome. And I
And,
like that
and
you also I like that
yeah.
you also have this knowledge of the US law as well, because what are some of the differences between custody in the US and custody in the UK?
Yeah, I think that's one of the main differences too. We don't call it custody, we call it one person will have, like the mother in the UK always has the rights to the child, and a father, if they're on the birth certificate, has obviously rights to access. And so if parents cannot agree, then they would have to go to the courts for the father to get access. So that's a big difference in the United States. They're calling it custody, whereas we call it the child lives with either one parent or both parents, and they have either contact with one parent or and live with another parent. So is that kind of clear?
Yes, yes, that answers
Yeah.
it. And I just want to shout out because Yellow Shirt Dad is here from your stream. Lexi is saying
Hello.
hello. And hello, Swanky.
Hello.
Welcome, welcome. You are here on time. We are just getting started. Welcome, Tabitha. If y'all can let us know where you're joining from, it'll just be nice to have that. I'm going to go ahead and give our disclaimer for today's conversation. So if people have questions, general questions, because we can't answer specific questions about your situation, but in general, we can just give some general tips, some general advice. But if you are needing legal or mental health help, I would seek out a solicitor or a lawyer in your area, or a therapist or psychologist in your area. Something that I see a lot in my practice, sometimes I get referrals for mental health evaluations, either for children in DSS
Mm.
care, or I get referrals for parents that are involved in custody issues. And what I do is I like to differentiate between a parenting capacity evaluation, because a parenting capacity in the US, that's typically where a psychologist will sit down with the parent and with the child, and it's a very lengthy, typically very expensive
Mm.
evaluation. I do not do those. I just do general psyche evals, and I also don't go looking for any specific trauma, or so, like if they're not sure, so I don't do
Right.
forensic evaluations, or because sometimes if they're suspecting abuse or neglect, there are people who are trained to do those types of evaluations.
Oh,
So I don't do those. I am
yeah.
aware of the techniques, but I just don't do those.
Right. I have had a few cases where we've had to get forensic psychologists to do reports and stuff. And so in the UK, what happens if parents cannot agree and they need to go to court? What they don't realize, like one major tip, is that once you start to use the courts in the UK, they automatically get Kafkas involved
So is
automatically.
that access to the mental health records?
It could be,
Or what's
yeah.
okay.
It's police records. So they will do a report. They'll meet with they'll talk to the parents on the phone, each parent separately. They'll find out what the issues are. And then that service will then provide the court with a report. So if one parent says, whatever they're going to say, and then the Kafkas officer, which is, a separate unit to social services, but then they look at, okay, are we going? Is the court going to need to investigate some more of this stuff? Okay, so that's a lot of people don't realize that. So that now you're on the system,
Wow. And in the
and
US, that can vary based on the state. It can really vary.
yeah. So yeah, so once they do their report, and they're going to do what's called as a safeguarding uh, checklist, and they're going to make sure that everything is. They're going to talk about the child, so everything is child based, right? So the interest, whereas you get a lot of parents who have had domestic abuse problems, and so they don't want the other parent to see the child or to have contact, because obviously they're afraid if they're drinking or if they're a drug user or whatever the case may be. So then the report might be saying, well, then you're going to have to, the court's going to have to make a drug test, or get the doctor's office to send a report, a prognosis, like of their mental capacity. There could be all kinds of things that the court would order after that, if the CAFCAS officer finds that there is valid reasons to do so. So the court gets a lot of assistance that way.
And in the United States, often what there is there can be a guardian ad litem that is
Yes. Yeah.
assigned, and that would be the lawyer that is supposed to be representing the child's best interests. Because
Yes.
in the US, both parent, they're each going to have their differing perspective. And we would hope that they would both have the child's best interest at heart, but their
Yes.
own desire. And so the courts, I think, appropriately understand that there needs to be a neutral party. Now, I have had some experiences with some great GALs, and I've had some experiences with some not so great ones. And it
Mm.
really can depend on just how often is that individual truly meeting with the child. I think they should have an unbiased perspective, because sometimes I've seen it's the person was
Oh.
clearly on one side or the other. And then if I'm ever brought in as the therapist, and I try to stay out of it, because the thing I like for people to
Mm.
know is that when you bring a therapist in, because let's say I'm the child's therapist, it can impact my therapeutic
Mhm.
relationship with that child. And or because that the other parent might get
Right.
mad about something that I have to say, or if parents are ever talking about bringing me into cases, I often tell them before we even, hey, this is what I can say and this is what I can't say.
Yeah.
I don't have an
Yeah.
opinion regarding custody. I can talk about some of the things, like these are the things I can talk about, and these are the things I can't talk about. Because ethically, some psychologists in my area have gotten in trouble for going in
Mhm.
and giving a legal opinion based on a parent that they
Oh,
had never met with. So they
right.
had an opinion about custody, but they had never talked. Like all of their information was based on what the other parent was giving them,
Had said.
which
Yeah.
our ethics board found to be unethical.
Right. And so in the UK, what the CAFCAS that I told you about, the service that is run by the government but separate from social services, they will have a guardian. And so the court, if the court feels like the parents can't represent the child's best wishes and interests, then they, in these difficult cases, if the parents are like this far apart, and um, then they might, you know, hire one of these. You can also ask the court to appoint one as well, and they are the same officers that do the reports, but they usually get someone else to do it. So you get somebody who writes the report, but then if there are really difficult situations, then what the court will do is they'll appoint a guardian, and they're obviously a little bit more expensive. So the court has to look at the cost of that as well.
Yep.
But they
And
represent the child themselves, like you said.
all right. And then also sometimes I've seen co-parenting issues come up where individuals are having difficulty figuring out how to agree on
Hmm.
certain things, or how, because in my state, Virginia, even if one parent has legal custody or has like full legal custody, that doesn't
Hmm.
take away that other parent's rights. Rights
Yeah.
in my state are typically only terminated by social services, and those are in very extreme cases. They typically try to have, because even I've worked with some kinship adoption, or I've worked with some other
Mm.
cases where that parent's parental rights were never like legally terminated,
Yeah.
and they did still have a say in school. They did still have a
Right.
say
Yeah.
in and all these other things. And so from my perspective, if safe, if it is okay, I try to see, can the child have a relationship with both parents if they can.
Hmm.
If they can.
Yeah.
Because sometimes I've seen people have, because of their own history with the other individual,
Hmm.
that understandably, they
Yeah.
understandably have difficulty because they don't want their child to be hurt and they want to protect them. And while, but often in my state, the courts are going, it has to be really, really bad for
Yeah.
somebody to have no contact. It has to
Yeah.
be really,
Yeah.
really bad
Mhm.
in order for there to be only supervised visitation.
Yeah, the same. In the UK, what happens when you let's say, so you're talking in some ways two different things. So if you got a private case, so the parents just can't agree, co-parenting issues, right? That's what we call a private case. But you can also have child protection case, which that's when the local county will look at, removal from the child, maybe temporary being with a grandparent, or foster care, or something else, right? Whatever is in the best interest of the children. Um, so there's two different avenues, right? So, like, for example, if you're a parent, and a tip for parents is that the worst thing you can say is, I can't cope. Yeah. If you tell a social service worker that, we had a few years ago, there was a lady in London, and she made a video about it, because she was like a counselor or something for the city, or something like that. Anyway, but she just said, oh, I just can't cope. Well, they started procedures to take the child away.
Yep.
Like,
Oh,
and
wow.
she was like this. And so I think social services have changed, at least in the UK. They're more signposting to different areas, and that's what um, so do you remember back in the day when they used to come and do visits, and so they will do stuff like that if you're on, like, if you've got child protection issues, right? So if there is child protection issues, then you'll be assigned a social worker, and that social worker will usually assign you different people to help you, you
Yeah.
know. But if it's a private case and you're just two parents who can't get along, you got to be careful of what you say, because the court's going to look at
Wow.
what your capabilities of parenting are as well. So the courts will usually ask the parents to take um, a co-parenting course,
Mhm.
so that they can learn, because obviously different parents have different parenting skills. You might be at dad's house and it's like pizza Friday night, late, staying up, not do your homework, whatever. Mom's more, structured or something. It's just different parenting,
Yeah.
you know?
And there's something called parallel parenting too.
Oh,
And so there's co parenting where we are both communicating, where we are working things out, we're coming to agreements. And that's where we can both communicate in a healthy way. And I think you mentioned that there are some co parenting apps and different things like that.
yes.
Sometimes
Yeah,
there's some
there's, yeah.
ways to make that a little bit easier. I've worked with some cases where co parenting was not an option, where we had to look at parallel parenting, where
Oh,
one
okay.
parent just had to say, what happens in that house if dad wants to keep them up until 3 a.m. on Friday, like that's just what happened, that the other parent just had to let that, as long as it wasn't
Yes. Okay.
unsafe, as long as there
I
wasn't
didn't know it
anything
had
that
a
was
name.
unsafe. Yeah,
Yeah.
so it's called parallel
Oh,
parenting, and
okay.
it often comes up when there's concerns about narcissistic type traits. That's
Mhm.
where I personally heard about it first, and
Oh,
it's
okay.
just where you let go of that control, because sometimes people will use the children to try to control, to try to
Yeah.
communicate. They
Yeah.
will intentionally like feed the children right before drop off, knowing that they were going to do dinner with the other parent, or they'll
Yeah.
intentionally drop them off hungry and not having, and just to kind of agitate the other parent. And so
That's
getting
interesting.
out
Yeah.
of some of those power struggles, that can be incredibly important. Before we go on, I just want to say to Yellow Shirt Dad, yes, I practice in Fredericksburg, Virginia, because I believe you are in Virginia as well. But
Yeah. Yeah. And in the UK, we have things where, honestly, I didn't know that that was the name for it, but where one parent will say, well, I go to church on Sundays with the children, and when you have them on the weekend, I want you to go to church with them. And the courts will look at what's in the best interest of the child. And because let's say they're only getting, it's not like a shared custody. So they're not doing like 1 week at mom's, 1 week at dad's, or equal time. They're just maybe having, every other weekend access. The courts will say, look, you can't dictate what dad is doing with the child when it's on the dad's time. If, you know, so, but now I can give it a name: parallel parenting.
yep.
So
And
that's
if
cool.
you look into it, like people will dive deeper, just not trying to control what happens in the other person's household. Now, things like school, like doctor's appointments, there are other things that we do have to communicate about and that we do have to be on the same page. But if they're going to have them on a completely different schedule, and we've tried to talk about it, there isn't
Mhm.
a therapist or somebody saying it has to be this way, because sometimes I've had individuals who are on the autism spectrum, or they
Mm.
had some type of concern where them being on a schedule needed to be court ordered, or like there needed to be some things
Yeah,
that
specifics. Um,
because it was
we
for
would
the
ask
health and well-being
for,
of the child.
yeah. And in the UK, you can ask for specifics in a court order if you think it's necessary, because sometimes the court order is so vague
Mhm.
that the parents will use that against the other person. So you want to make sure, if it's like, especially if it is an educational issue, uh, that both parents have a say. The other thing that has come up lately is parent night, school parent night,
Mhm.
and um, the schools have had to come up with giving dad 1 day and giving mom 1 day. So, I mean, we've got even that kind of a problem where they cannot even go together as a couple, So, and I think we had one school where, like they send out, what times do you want? And they only give one availability, and then the parents have to say, well, you go this year and I'll go next year, because they're only giving one appointment available. So so we have a lot of specific court orders that will say, you get Christmas this year, the other person gets New Year's next year or something. So it gets that bad where the parents just cannot agree. So that's one big tip, is that parents think going to court is going to solve all their problems, but it's going to make them work together for the
Yeah.
benefit of the child.
Yeah. And really, a lot of courts, I know in the US, they'll get upset if people come over minor things. Like if the person is dropping them off 10 minutes late, or I don't know, like if there are minor things that they kind of have to work out together. I've seen the courts, because it does take up a space
Yeah.
on docket from somebody
Hmm.
else that might have a more pressing concern. And I think you were going to bring up passports, because in the US, both
Yeah.
parents have to be present for, and I've had
Okay.
some situations where people have had to get the court to like order the individual to cooperate with completing the passport, or they've had to bring the passport document, because in the US there's a document that can be signed and
Hmm.
notarized, saying that, because they just want both parents to be aware that there's a passport, to just make sure that somebody isn't trying to take the child illegally. Like I think that's really, it's really to kind of reduce those types of situations. But yeah.
Yeah, the same. And a lot of times, let's say the one parent's holding the passport, they might not give that passport to the other parent. So we might have to say in the order that the parents have to agree, let's say 6 weeks ahead of time, get the agreement from the other parent, agree when the passport is going to be exchanged. And I've even had cases where we're doing an emergency court on the day the person's flying because the other parent won't give the passport, or the other parent's taking them. And we've even had to get the law enforcement involved to get them off a plane. That's like, because they didn't have that access to take them. It's crazy when, and the sad thing, it's the children that are suffering, isn't it?
I agree.
Yeah. So the one thing I wanted to know from your perspective is, so you've kind of explained how doing expert reports works. Expert reports cost a lot of money. And I don't know how much they really contribute, to be fair, because the court still wants the parents to either co-parent,
And I've definitely seen situations where it has been helpful, where people are alleging there are mental health concerns, and but a licensed provider doesn't or finds one or doesn't find one. And my thing is always, even if somebody has a mental health concern, that doesn't mean that they're not able to parent. So if I'm doing that type of evaluation and the person does have significant depression, or there is PTSD or something like that, I'm going to have recommendations at the end of that report for that individual. And because I don't do those parenting capacities, because a parenting capacity would look at, are they capable of providing a child with the love and support and care that child needs.
And the child itself. So the child can be interviewed by the officers, like, the court officers, social services, sorry, and the judge. I even had one case where the judge was speaking to the child. The judge said, well, the one parent brought the child to court, and the judge said, well, I'll speak to the child myself. And what was interesting is that people don't realize how neglect and cruel punishment is. Thank you. Thank you, yellow shirt dad. So you've got to, like, if you're going to be disciplining children, you got to look at the mental aspect that that's going to have on the child. And so if they don't want to live with you and they tell that to somebody, then their wishes and feelings are going to be, but there's a fine line between alienation.
And there are times when a child doesn't want to live with a parent, and it's because the parent is setting like appropriate boundaries, or because they're setting, or, the child is appropriately feeling, stuck in between the two. Or I've had some cases where the child just had a friend group at one house and didn't really have a friend group at the other house. Or like there can just be these little nuances.
Or
and so
they
I
use
do
the
think
parents as like to punish the parents, like, so they bounce between the parents, right? They'll say, well, dad lets me do this, I want to stay an extra day, or I don't want to go home, or so they're playing the parents as well. And I think the parents have to be smart and say, look, I know this is, that they're just, they could be just doing that to get one person's attention or something, yeah.
And a case that's been drawing a lot of attention right now is the Ruby Frankie case and the Frankie children. And as a lawyer, just interested if there were any thoughts that you had or anything that you wanted to say related to custody on that case.
Yeah, so I've not actually seen a lot of that, but obviously because it's just started. I mean, I think I saw that. I think it was on one of your chats, and I said, "Is that the one where the child ran to the neighbor's house,
Yeah.
and was starving and had been bound, and
Yeah.
I mean, it was just unbelievable." And I think where you've got parents that are cruel, I mean, that's just cruel. That's child protection. That is removal. That is criminal, isn't it? And so it'll be interesting to see what happens. What I don't think is right is that, from what I've heard so far, is that they're blaming the child. They're passing the blame. So they're trying to say that their behavior was okay because of the child's behavior, and it was a form of discipline, which is criminal activity. Cannot,
Yeah.
you can't be a vigilante with your own children, right?
Yeah. And with the custody part of this, because the dad's lawyer has come forward and released some statements that
Mhm.
he and his wife had been separated for about 18 months, and
Okay.
that, sorry, 13, for about 13 months, and that he hadn't seen or talked to the kids in
Oh,
that period of time.
so he wasn't
And
even having contact.
and because supposedly Ruby told him that they needed that in order for them to heal their marriage. And it sounds a lot like what happened to Adam Steed, he's a former patient of Jody
Joking.
Hildebrand, that's come forward and shared his story, that just some
Yeah,
of
I
the
haven't heard
alienation
that one
within the
yet.
family that can happen. And because what I've seen happen, because I know the father is trying to see if he can get custody of the children. And I think social services is going to be very slow to give the children to anyone without
Mm.
thoroughly vetting to make sure, are you, number one, going to keep the kids safe? So we've had
Yeah.
situations where parents have had rights terminated because they
Mhm.
refuse to protect the child from a confirmed abuser. Like the parent was not protecting the child, and the parent
Yeah,
would not
because
leave the person, or like they continued to have the person in the home, or the kids were
yeah.
around the individual. And they DSS told the parents, like, you're either going to lose your kids, or you have to leave this individual. And there were people that chose to stay in that in their relationship.
Well, and so, for example, and I've had permission to tell this story. I won't mention names or
Yeah.
real details, but I had a case where a parent sent me some photos and said, "Karen, what can we do? Is this child abuse?" So the pictures were like full of, ashtrays full of cigarette butts, beer cans everywhere. You could tell that it was the mother in this case was having parties. The child's room was just, I mean, you wouldn't put anybody in there, like not even a pet, I mean, it
Yeah.
was that bad. And so I said, well, that is a child protection issue, and we can go to the courts for this. So we did. And what our courts do is, because the child did love the mother, like there was absolutely no problems with the child loved to see the mother. But the drinking and the partying and everything was a problem. So the court gave an opportunity to stop that kind of behavior. When that behavior didn't stop, then it went to a stricter contact. So it's kind of like a scale. So you can do the scale either, starting it out this way or going to it if it's not getting better, right? So you might say, well, okay, until things get better, you're just going to be able to see them in the community for a couple hours a day on a Saturday or something like that. Well, in this case, the mother was still drinking, and the child would say, "Mommy's still drinking." So we'd go back to court, and then it was more limited to phone calls, video calls, so that at least the child had some contact,
Yeah.
right? But then the mother wouldn't call;
Yeah.
she'd forget, and so the child, it was like so sad. But the sadder thing was the mother died of an overdose, and a
Yeah.
very young lady, beautiful, beautiful lady. Child absolutely loved her, but we were adamant to the court. We did not want her rights taken away because the child said he loved her. And sometimes I think it's about the other parent understanding maybe what one parent is going through, and saying, well, look, if we can work something out, the courts are likely to do it, but they'll want to manage it, in a way that there isn't a child protection issue. If I don't know if, and so you can sort of start with, okay, you can see 1 hour, and if it gets better, then you can add another hour, and then you can add another, then you can do overnight stays, and then you can do vacations, and so we try to do it that way, where to keep the contact there. So it's really sad that he didn't have contact, because maybe if he had contact, he would have seen what was going on, the
And
change
yeah,
behavior.
that's a really difficult situation. And in the UK, do they allow communication or visits in prison?
Yeah, so with the prison service, it depends, right? If they allow writing, you can write to them, and the child could write back. If we try to keep prisoners, like if you're an offender, we try to keep them in areas so families can keep in contact, because if it's like, the offense had nothing to do with the child, right? Then what you want to do is you want to keep them. And this is where, when I was a parole officer for Canada Corrections, what we would try to do, and I'm sure social services are like this too, but we want to keep families together, keep, availability in the community, so they have something to go back to, they have something to look forward to. So yeah, so if there's no problem, they don't get internet, so they can't do like a FaceTime or anything like that. So but yeah, they would be able to write to them if it's not, if it's there's not a child protection issue. Yeah.
Nice.
So what's else? Was there a question there? Let's see.
I will. If the
Physical.
physical is removed, where is the line of on raising the children in a manner the parent sees fit? Oh, physical contact? Can you clarify what you mean by that part? This case is so
Physical
deep.
abuse, maybe. Might be the
Yeah,
abuse.
maybe.
Is
Yeah.
offender, or I don't know.
I'm not sure.
Well,
This case
where
is so
is
deep. I wonder if it's the Jody Frankie one. Many do not see a problem. And so for me, um so when I first started out as a therapist, because in my state corporal punishment is legal, and I have seen a lot of major issues come up related to that, even when done in a way that didn't legally constitute physical abuse. It sends a mixed message to a child. And my favorite example is I was in the mall one day, and somebody had like a 3-year-old child and maybe like a 1-year-old child, and the 3-year-old hit the 1-year-old, and the mom said, "Don't hit." So the kid hit her back. She was like, "Don't hit," and he hit her back. And it was just like, yeah, like hitting a child for hitting, like they're not going to get the message that hitting isn't okay. And for me personally, because it is
yeah,
illegal for me to hit my
yeah.
husband, so I don't hit my son. And a lot of that, a lot of therapists, a lot of people are starting to realize the harm of what physical
Mm.
discipline can do. That was one of my constructs that I studied for my dissertation on
Oh, okay.
forgiveness and aggressive children. And so I know a lot about that research. And back when I did the research, there were cultural differences with the
Mm.
outcomes. And in
Yeah.
practice, I'm not seeing those cultural differences anymore. So years ago, maybe back in the
Oh,
90s, we
yeah.
saw some cultural differences. I am not seeing cultural
Oh,
differences
so
in
so it's
now.
not. I mean, the thing that I would be concerned about is,
Mhm.
like, when you're looking at discipline, I say to parents, like, and I'm not a counselor, so I just say, well, what are you doing? Because the court's going to look at your behavior. And like, and I say this all the time, your behavior is just as important as the other parent's behavior.
Yeah.
And so what you want to do, I think children learn by example. And
Yeah.
what we have, like, again, when I was, working in different areas of the law, so I worked for youth offending for a long time, and I did a lot of studies on recidivism,
Mhm.
and we find that abuse behavior, all kinds of these things are usually passed on. And so I think it's best if a parent can say, look, I know I come from this kind of background. I don't want this to repeat. And using someone like yourself, to get counseling to make sure they see the signs, because I think if you don't have cognitive awareness and things to put in place, like if let's say the child comes home from school and you're really upset and you've had a hard day and they're looking for attention, and there's ways to, let's say, cope. Then you add a custody battle on top, right? So then that child will go and get upset and say to the father or whatever, the mother, the like they're so sensitive that yelling at them or taking their phone away or doing anything is going to go to the other parent, and that's going to give the other parent fuel in court, right? And is that fair? I don't know. It's like,
And that's when I think having a neutral person that can kind of be in the middle can sometimes help. And so, because when children aren't okay, we know based on their behavior. And so sometimes a kid, like their grades start falling, or sometimes there can be these signs that the child could maybe benefit from talking to someone. And there are normal difficulties that happen, because sometimes I'll get someone will say to me, the day of transition. So either the day
mm,
they switch or the
yes,
day they come back, those are always
yes,
very difficult days. And we talk
yes.
about what are some things we can do to manage that. So let's not have a ton of chores to have to do that day. Like, let's try to make that day fun and light. Like, let's reinforce practicing some of those coping skills, practicing some of that. And I might just know as a parent, okay, they're just going to be a little bit more antsy today. And but then over time things settle. But just because they have that doesn't mean that they shouldn't see the other parent at all, because there is some discomfort that's not, the
Mm.
court isn't going to do anything about. And me as a therapist, I normally want to try, if people can have a healthy relationship with the other parent, that is the goal. That is definitely the goal.
And the other thing, so in the UK, they've started this new thing of, well, it was a few years ago. I've done lots of videos on it, but it's when they have to do a MIAMS, it's called. So they have to go for a mediation assessment, which means they've gone to a mediator and they've said, look, they offer the other parent mediation, and the government's put a lot of money into that. So to hopefully settle cases before they go to court, right? If the other, I mean, that can be just, and the original reason was to stop the fees going up so much, because obviously litigating custody in court
A
is,
lot.
when you see, I mean, one time I had a client come to me and I think they had spent like 50,000 by the time I got the case, and it hadn't even gone to the second hearing. It was like crazy, crazy money. And so the MIAMs were in place to see if, that could reduce the cost first and hopefully get the parents to agree. But the mediators are not legally trained. So they might say something and then they come to me and I say, well, wait a minute, that's not going to fly with the court, or whatever. So mediation is really good. So you can do alternative to mediation, where if, like I said, if we put what's called as a position statement together,
Mhm.
and the other side then gets a time to respond to that, and then hopefully with this back and forth, by the time we go to court, everybody can agree on something. But sometimes parents are just so, like, they do not want it's just.
We got another great question. So I believe T is in North Carolina, and
Okay.
Guardian ad litem is a voluntary service there. And in my state, Guardian ad litems do get paid. I
Mm.
think it's kind of, I don't, the rate probably isn't their typical rate. Sometimes either the parents split the bill if it's a private case, or if it's a social services case, I believe they're paid by the state. But in my state, we have what's called a CASA worker, which is a court appointed special advocate. And
Mhm.
that can be volunteer. So that's typically just a community member that just follows up on some things and maybe has a little bit. So it's not like because the guardian ad litem can request my records, and all they have to do is send me their letter of appointment, because they are like another guardian appointed by the
Right.
court for this child. Versus the CASA worker, they normally have releases signed so that they can communicate with different people, and sometimes they also give an opinion in
Right.
cases.
Yeah. And the same. So to answer her question, has kind of moved up now.
Oh,
Um, so yeah, so the a guardian would be you can get a guardian from, it's like the court appoints, it's a court appointed guardian, it's called here, and they're paid by the government, but they might need some reports to be able to make decisions, and so that's where costs can come up. um, for example, grandparents don't have access rights in the UK. They don't have parental responsibility, it's called. So if you look at if you've got parental responsibility, it means that you have to house the child, feed them, take care of their needs and stuff. So because at first, when I first, the having that being different in the law, I thought, well, that's crazy. Of course, grandparents should have access to their children, but because they don't have to, they don't have to make decisions of where they're going to go to school. They don't have to give money to make sure they're housed and stuff. So I can understand that. And so if like a grandparent wants to get access to the child, and you've got one parent that disagrees, obviously, because you wouldn't be in court otherwise,
yeah.
then the judge might say, well, look, we need a guardian to decide this. And then that way the grandparents can be interviewed and they can make statements and stuff like that, because yeah, it's really sad when couples split up, and yeah. So I don't know if I've answered that question.
You did.
Does
You did.
every child deserves representation? Yeah. So
And the
the
one
whole
thing, go ahead.
is to get the representation for the child, and a lot of weight is given on the child's wishes and feelings, their age, their understand, like how much they understand things, and the courts have been recently, over the last few years, been training in alienation, how to spot it, to if there's too much, let's say, negative comments about one person, then that might be a sign that there is alienation. Okay, sorry, I've interrupted you there.
No. And so you can go ahead.
Yeah. So there are ways that the court, looks at this. And I wanted to make a point from when you said about parents, having coping issues. And I think you said like anxiety and stuff like that. And if that's being put onto the child, then that is a worry for the children, because the number one thing in the UK is education. And if a child cannot cannot go to school, cannot do their homework, cannot have this, they shouldn't be worried about the other parent, right? So that holds a lot of weight. But they do have specialists that will actually work with the parents to help them, which is really good. So there is a lot of organizations, like you said, if they don't want to use somebody like me who just knows the process of the law, and they want to have an organization that helps from an emotional side, then those are there. And we had the family court manager come out. I put a video on that too, with an announcement saying the courts have to accept that there's going to be all kinds of people coming before the court. Not everybody can afford the top-notch barrister, because in England you have to have a barrister to represent you. It's not a solicitor. Solicitors are more, doing the writing things and preparing cases and stuff. So the family court manager has said, courts should be aware of this. But I have been in so many courts where it's a thing nowadays. You said the courts get very angry. That is happening in our courts as well, which I never saw it before. But I think this is the problem. If a litigant in person is not respectful to the court is going to say something. And that's one thing. If you're going to be a litigant in person, so you bring a friend with you, or it has to be somebody independent because family matters are not public matters, then you have to be very controlled in how you behave in court. And your behavior in court will say a lot to the judge, won't it? So if you're really bad in court, the judge is going to say, well, I can see this is not good for a child, and they may decide something else, that is not good for the person who actually wanted whatever they wanted, right? Because it was maybe unreasonable.
All right. And so I'd love for you to think about what your final thoughts are on this topic. I will go on ahead and share mine first. So
Okay.
for me, the thing that I always like for people to know is that children do best in homes where they feel safe and secure. And so if the two people are together, and if together they can't create a safe and stable environment, kids will
Mhm.
do better in and where at least one of those homes
Yeah.
can be safe and stable. Because often people are like, divorce, it's so horrible for kids, but two parents together that are arguing constantly, that are at each other's throats, that are saying and doing things that are harmful to one another, and often in front of the children, that is going to take a huge
Mhm.
toll on that child's mental health. And I've heard kids say, I wish my parents should have split earlier. Or like when the kids know, because sometimes the adults think they're hiding it very well, they're doing it when the kids go to sleep, but often when kids can be on alert, and when you
Mhm.
don't think they're listening, they might actually be listening. And so making
Yeah.
sure to create at
Yeah.
least, kids need a safe and stable place where they can settle. And just because it's a two-parent household does not necessarily mean that it's more safe and stable. And then for some individuals, they have to stay in difficult situations because financially they don't have any other choice. And so that's where getting help and support to navigate those things.
Mhm.
I've worked with individuals on how they can connect to different resources. What were their different options?
Mhm.
What were their choices? And making sure that you have support throughout that whole process. In the U.S., a divorce lawyer, like if you're not mediating it, if it's going to be contentious, it can be anywhere between 15,000 and the upwards of like 80,000, $100,000 to. And then also in the U.S., that person can continue to bring you back to court all the time.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
so, because I've seen cases where they didn't have a lawyer, like it was just that the individual keeps filing because of different,
Mhm.
wanting child support to get looked at again, or wanting
Yeah.
days to be looked at again, or wanting different things. Like they just keep bringing it back to the court, which for someone who's experienced a lot within the marriage and finally feels free, it can really bring up a lot for an individual going through all of that again. And so those are just some general things that I like to share. And so what are
Mhm.
some of your closing thoughts on this topic?
Yeah. So I think my biggest tip for people is that if you think that it's going to be simple in court, even if you hire a solicitor, if you do it yourself, or if whatever, it's going to be a lot of work, and it could be very, very expensive. Um, the one thing that you should know is the court isn't interested in your griping. They're interested in what the child's best needs are. So it's number one. um, and so you have to be really careful that if you're not putting their needs first, their educational needs, their emotional needs, all of those things, be careful. You're not allowed to speak to the child about the case, because that could have some impact on the child worrying. And the courts are very concerned about, so they're not going to make a decision that is like, oh, this is going to sort out that problem right now. They're looking for long-term solutions. Okay. So parents think, oh, you won't let me take them on vacation next Thursday or whatever, so I'm going to court. So the courts have actually said if you're bringing frivolous cases to court, then like right now we don't have, like, if you don't have to pay the other person's costs, like that's not an automatic. It is up to the judge. So you could end up with costs for bringing frivolous cases to court. And so if I could get any message to a parent, it's that you might think that's really, really important, but you got to look at the big picture. Like, so for example, we've had cases where like there's a big celebration for a family, a big reunion, and the one parent won't let the other person go. And so you've got to say, okay, well, I'll let you go, but I get another day, right? So we'll swap days. Be fair, be reasonable. Look at everything as it's for your child. Be reasonable for your child. And the other point is to make sure that you're not talking bad in front of the other parent, because I think that has a negative impact on the child. And it can actually work in reverse, because the child doesn't see that. And that's kind of like gaslighting, isn't it? Like, I'm not familiar with that term as much as probably you are, but I know we're supposed to be doing closing.
No, you're good. And so what can happen when you talk negatively about the child, about the other parent in front of the child, even if it's true, even if the child knows it, it does create this separation. And really, so within healthy families, the parents are on the same team and the siblings are on the same team. It's not mom and son against dad. It's not dad and daughter against mom. Like that we call that triangulation. Like that ends up creating difficult boundaries. And so even if the bond between mom and dad has broken, if they can present as the same team. So I often give people recommendations, because let's say dad canceled the visit, to try to not throw dad under the bus. I've had some people where the parent was not consistent with visitation, so they wouldn't even tell the child about it until it was for sure going to happen, because they knew that it might
that
be canceled, and they didn't even want to have to see the disappointment in their child's face or anything. But then also don't lie. And what I mean by don't lie, so I was raised by a single parent. We got to this at like the end of the video. My mom, at one point, she would buy things and say they were from my dad, but they weren't. And so that I wouldn't do that.
Oh, wow.
And so making sure to if the individual, if they don't send anything for the birthday, like it helping the child cope with that sadness, helping them deal with
You're gonna
that. But
have to
like
deal with
there,
life in reality, isn't it? It's like what was that on Friends or something, that he found out that the dog was a different dog all through, or there was a cat or something. It was like the parents hadn't told him that he died. He said, no, my dog's lasted for like 50 years, whatever. So I think sometimes reality, but again, we've got to be really careful with the reality as well, and how to share information with children, isn't it? Because again, the courts, what people don't realize is the courts, once one parent says something, the courts are going to look into it. And that's the sad thing, is that it's almost like false allegations. You don't know. I mean, didn't we just have this one case? We've got the Jody one, but and Rudy, right? And Jody. And then the other case that come up with, remember the mother they said she tried to kill the father, to hire people to kill the father over, and the grandparents were really involved in that case. So I think sometimes grandparents should be aware, sometimes just stay out of it if there is, issues. But some people do have money and they just think, oh, I can fight this in court. And the sad thing is the people that don't have money and they do have a really genuine issue, right? So I don't know if that's enough tips. It's like,
Yeah. And so I'm glad that we were able to partner for this
yeah,
conversation. This is
you
on
know,
both of our streams.
right.
And so how can people follow you? How can people keep up with you?
Yeah, so I'm on YouTube and Instagram, and I have a website. Um, and yeah, they can just call if they need assistance. Um, I started my YouTube channel because of lockdown. I think a lot of people did, because I find that I get a lot of the same questions from people. So that's another tip. You're not the only one. You are not the only one. You are The things you're worried about are things that other people are most likely worried about. So I thought if I had a YouTube channel where I could say, "Oh, look at this video," and then call me back, and then they get a bit of information. So the videos aren't meant to advise; they're meant to inform. And I think I always end my videos with information is power, because when you have information, if you know a process of how something is going to work, then it's almost like a chess game. You can say, "Oh boy," like some people will call me up and say, "Oh, this, and this." And then when I do the review of the case, I find out that's not, because that's their perspective.
Yeah.
Right. So, working with people like yourself that do psychological work, that is brilliant, because if a person can deal with their issues before they come for legal help, that will really make a big difference, because they need to be able to focus not on themselves, on their children, and on what's the best situation. So I always recommend, I do work with counselors and say, "Look, I've got a case, can you help out with that?" Because sometimes you need to get over that before you can, and you don't want that to happen through a court process,
Yeah.
if that makes sense. Yeah.
It does. It does. And I am at
And
Dr.
you tell how
Patrice.
people how you.
I am at Dr. Patrice Berry across
Oh
platforms,
no.
TikTok, YouTube,
Yeah.
Instagram. And so I hope y'all enjoy the rest of your day, and we will see you all soon. Have a good one.